Now, at the turn of the century, the dot-com bubble burst. Then, in 2008, the collapse of a bubble in US house prices triggered the global financial crisis. Fast forward to 2017, Richard Thaler, the father of behavioural economics, is handed the Nobel Prize in economics, just as world stock markets hit new record highs. Thaler's work is all about how humans make irrational money choices. You may even remember him from the Hollywood movie The Big Short. In post-prize announcement interviews, he said that he's worried about the fact that nothing is spooking stock markets. They just keep crawling higher. Well, the International Monetary Fund has spent the last decade trying to pick up the pieces after failing to predict the last financial crisis. This week, the IMF said that nearly 75% of the world is now experiencing an upswing. It's predicting that the world's economy will expand by 3.6% in 2017 and by 3.7% in 2018. That's slightly higher than what it was predicting back in July. But the IMF also issued a warning. It said record low borrowing costs designed to help the economic recovery are pushing up debt levels in the world's largest economies. And it singled out China as one of the worst offenders. Well, the IMF and the World Bank are hosting a meeting in Washington, D.C., where finance ministers and central bankers from around the world are gathered. Shihab Ratanzi reports.
The World Bank president says governments around the world need to spend.
All countries need to invest more in their people.
It's been a rough few decades for the World Bank and the IMF's reputations. Most recently, they failed to see the economic crash of 2008 coming, despite the millions of dollars they spend to monitor the world economy for just such crashes. And since 2008, as the sort of austerity programs long imposed on developing nations have been forced on developed countries like Greece, awareness and discontent with the IMF has grown. Finally, last year, things seemed to change. The IMF published an analysis that admitted its neoliberal policies caused economic damage. And this week, the fund declared increasing taxes on the wealthy would not impede economic growth and would help address inequality.
The result is growing political tensions in many places and increased skepticism about the benefits of globalization.
But for the leaders of the 133 global groups protesting outside the meetings, the policies haven't changed overall with the rhetoric. For example, raising taxes on the rich. Neoliberalism says any monies raised by the government should then be given to private corporations. The Fight Inequality Alliance says any concern expressed about increasing inequality doesn't match the current policies of the World Bank and the IMF, such as their pushing of drastic cuts in Mongolia, Tunisia and Zambia, and leading the privatization of primary schools in Liberia, and funding investments in projects in Honduras on land violently seized from peasants. The IMF failed to respond to our request for an interview. One of the social indicators that the IMF and World Bank often take comfort in is the huge reduction in global extreme poverty over the last few decades. Surely, they argue, proof that their brand of neoliberal globalization is working. However, a new report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research released this week found that 2/3 of the net reduction in extreme poverty in the world since 1990 was in China, which rejected that neoliberal economic model.
The rebound in the 21st century was partly due to the fact that the IMF lost almost all of its influence in middle-income countries.
For skeptics, both the IMF and the World Bank have yet to prove that their stated wish to eradicate poverty is anything more than a public relations strategy to conceal the same old economic approach.
Joining us now from London is David Coker. David is a lecturer of finance at the University of Westminster in London. Good to have you with us again, David. So you've got the world's brightest and best financial minds meeting this week in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank and IMF meetings. They don't exactly have the greatest record, though, when it comes to predicting trouble ahead, do they?
No, sir, they don't. And particularly we see their forecasts, their GDP forecasts, are very volatile when there's political instability.
So the World Bank, the IMF, reputation severely dented after failing to predict the economic crisis, the last economic crisis in 2007, 2008. Are they smart enough? Are we smart enough, our governments, our institutions smart enough to avoid another catastrophe like that?
The systems are very complex. I think we understand the mechanisms, and we've got a good feeling of what has to be done. I'm not convinced the political will is there. So even though some of the best minds at the IMF and the World Bank write excellent papers, that talk about the solutions. We just don't have the political will to implement them. They're calling for larger or higher taxes, I should say, on the upper wealth echelons. So we've got the 1%, and more importantly, the 1/10 of 1%, who saw in the wake of the financial crisis, saw their wealth soar. And yet we also know at the same time, people in the lower 99% saw their wealth stagnate and in far too many cases decline. So I think we've got to align our political leadership with the IMF and the World Bank, start to open up, and we do have to take some choices which many of the elites may find unpalatable. Taxes do have to go up. We have to engage in a period of progressive policies that will help open up education for more people. If we can start to do this, if we can start to get control of the political environment, and in particular the instability that's bubbling underneath the surface, I think when the next financial crisis comes, because it's only a matter of time, we'll be in a much stronger position. If it were to hit tomorrow, I would suspect we'd see open revolution in some of the Western democracies. Some of them are very, very unstable at this point. It's bubbling beneath the surface. So our leaders have to take the difficult decisions to do what's necessary to calm people down, to give people the perspective, or the view, I should say, that there is opportunity for everyone, in spite of the changes we're going through, not only politically, but technologically, which is also something they're considering this week, these massive changes that are coming due to technological innovation.
Yeah, I mean, the World Bank, one of the things that is warning about is the risk that automation poses to all of us who work for a living. I mean, they're looking sort of 20 years, 30 years down the line. Are they right to be doing that and warning about something which is so far in the future, given all the problems that exist in the world today right now?
Well, there are a lot of problems now, but we have to face the fact that this fourth wave, as we call it, the digital revolution, it's not coming, it's here. And a lot of people have overlooked, banking, for instance, my area, we're starting to see bots take over a lot of traditional jobs. We feel that a lot of banking jobs, maybe as many as 30% of banking jobs will be wiped out. That's the tip of the iceberg. When we start to see these upper skilled jobs wiped out, just decimated, what will it do to lower skilled jobs? People that, for instance, and I don't mean this to sound horrible, but people that deal with customers. We can program a bot that can do many of the queries. And a lot of companies, in fact, are playing with that. They're experimenting with these things. If you take a look at what Tencent in China is up to, Tencent in China pioneered these AI bots, and they've got a user base of some 700 million people who are quite happily using bots to plan holidays, to schedule dinner reservations, to book a car, to plan anniversary trips, things like that. A lot of these jobs that are done by people right now, they're going to be wiped out. So the revolution's upon us. Again, it's up to our leaders to listen to what the World Bank, and even to take a look at what's going on in banking and other areas, and start to address start to address the changes and try to figure out what we're going to do with people. Unfortunately, I do feel a lot of our leadership is sleepwalking. They're letting the changes roll on. And again, we're going to see massive spikes in unemployment, not this time in the agricultural sector or the manufacturing sector, which were impacted by the earlier waves of automation. Now it's squarely in this digital sector of the economy. It's going to be squarely in the middle class services and upper middle class services. And it is something to worry about, and it will give rise, if there's another financial crisis and if these job cuts come, it will give rise to political instability we probably haven't seen since the 30s.
David, I think it's really good to talk to you, given the rather pessimistic nature of what we've been discussing. But many thanks indeed for being with us. Great to have you on Counting the Cost.
Thanks for your time, Adrian. Take care.